Here's a claim you've probably heard, and it happens to be true. John Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough, fought his great set-piece battles against the army of Louis XIV and won every one of them. In the words of a captain who served under him and kept a diary, he never fought a battle which he did not gain, nor laid siege to a town which he did not take. Now, if you know your period, you already know the complication, and we're going to deal with it honestly. Because a spotless battle record and a won war are not the same thing. The alliance he led would ultimately settle for a compromise peace. And more than one serious historian, from Knoop in the 19th century to Cathal Nolan today, has argued that his success owed as much to Dutch money, superb Dutch and British infantry, a brilliant co-commander in Prince Eugene, and some frankly mediocre opponents, as it did to the Duke himself. So this video isn't hero worship. It's an honest look at 3 of his tactical decisions. What was genuinely brilliant about them, what was luck, and what modern historians actually argue over. Because even after you strip away the legend, what's left is one of the most interesting military minds this country ever produced. And a man his own descendant, Winston Churchill, spent 1,000,000 words trying to rescue from being forgotten. 3 moves. Keep score, and tell me at the end which one you think holds up best under scrutiny. Let's start with the campaign that made his name. In 1704, the Grand Alliance had a strategic emergency. A Franco-Bavarian army was positioned to march down the Danube on Vienna, and if Vienna fell, Austria was likely knocked out of the war and the whole coalition against France could unravel. The trouble was that the Alliance's best field army, Marlborough's, was up in the Low Countries, the wrong end of the continent. Marlborough's answer was to march it roughly 250 miles to the Danube. And the reason this is studied to this day isn't romance, it's logistics. Moving 40,000 men that distance in about 5 weeks, in an era when armies routinely dissolved on the road from disease and desertion, and arriving fit to fight, was genuinely exceptional. He prearranged supply and payment along the whole route, so as Captain Robert Parker recorded, the soldiers had nothing to do but pitch their tents, boil kettles, and lie down to rest. Fresh boots were waiting in Germany. The historian John Lynn calls the campaign one of the finest examples of marching and fighting before Napoleon, and that's the sober assessment, not the fans. Now, the deception. And here I want to be precise, because there's a popular version of this story that overstates it. Marlborough disguised his true destination. As he moved south, he behaved as though he might be aiming at the Moselle, and then at Alsace on France's Rhine frontier, even having bridging prepared on the Rhine, which encouraged the French Marshal Villeroy to shadow him and hold forces back to defend France rather than reinforce the Danube. That much is solid. What you'll sometimes hear is that he hid the plan from his own government entirely, a lone genius defying the politicians. He couldn't operate without the Dutch, who underwrote his logistics, and he kept them broadly consulted. What he did do was keep the specific final objective closely held. And there's a good case, made by historians like Faulkner and Holmes, that some of his stated intentions were partly designed to maneuver an obstructive Allied colleague, the Margrave of Baden, out of his way. Deception aimed at the enemy, yes, but also a bit of coalition politics. That's the more interesting truth. He linked up with Prince Eugene of Savoy, and on the 13th of August, they turned to fight Marshal Tallard near the village of Blenheim. And Tallard genuinely did not expect to be attacked. He assumed the Allies, low on supply late in the season, would withdraw. Here's the well-documented bit that people garble. French prisoners taken beforehand reported, under questioning, that the whole Allied army intended to march off toward Nordlingen, and several accounts suggest Marlborough had deliberately fed that impression. So when the Allied army formed up and came on, It caught a French command that had half convinced itself the enemy was leaving. The tactical execution is the part that holds up completely. Marlborough read that the hinge between the two French armies, their center, was held mainly by unsupported cavalry. He fed attacks into the fortified villages on the flanks, Blenheim on the French right above all. And here's the key. Those attacks drew in French reserves and packed thousands of infantry uselessly into a village where they couldn't maneuver. With the center thus starved, he crossed the Nebel Stream and drove his main cavalry mass straight through it. The French line split. His horse wheeled and rolled Tallard's wing back against the Danube, where over 3,000 men are estimated to have drowned. Tallard himself was captured. At a cost of around 12,000 Allied casualties, the Franco-Bavarian army lost something in the order of 30,000 killed, wounded, and captured, Tallard among the prisoners. Vienna was saved, and Bavaria was knocked out of the war. And the human detail that survives is real, not folklore. With the battle won, Marlborough scribbled a note to his wife Sarah on the back of an old tavern bill, steadying it on a drum. "I have not time to say more," it read, "but to beg you will give my duty to the Queen and let her know her army has had a glorious victory." So, first move, strip out the myth, and what's left is still formidable. A logistical feat few contemporaries could match, a well-run deception, and a genuinely brilliant piece of battlefield reading at the center. Question for you, and I mean it as a real one for this audience. How much of Blenheim was Marlborough's genius, and how much was Tallard's mistake in dividing his command and over-garrisoning that village? Make the case in the comments, because the second battle is where the enemy's error shrinks and the Duke's own hand grows. 2 years later, at Ramillies in the Spanish Netherlands, Marlborough fought what many historians, and I'd agree with them, consider his finest, purely tactical performance. Roughly 62,000 Allied troops against about 60,000 French and Allies under Villeroy. Near parity. Which means the margin here was almost entirely purely command. Start with the ground, because it's the foundation of everything that follows. The French deployed in a long arc. Marlborough's line, by contrast, sat on the inside of that curve, a convex position, which gave him what soldiers call interior lines. He could move troops from one part of his front to another across the short inside of the arc, faster than Villeroy could counter, by moving around the long outside. That geometric edge is the engine of the whole battle. He opened with a hard push on his right, under Lord Orkney, against the French left around the villages of Office and Autre-Église. Now, here is a genuine historian's debate worth flagging, because you may know it. It is often called a pure feint, but David Chandler, the major Marlborough scholar, argues it was probably launched as a serious probe to test the sector, and only became a feint once Marlborough saw the real opportunity elsewhere. Either way, the effect was the same. Villeroy took the threat seriously and committed attention and reserves to his left. And then comes the touch that soldiers love. When Marlborough pulled Orkney's infantry back off that flank to redeploy them, he had them leave their colors, their standards, planted where they had been. Across the smoke, the French still saw regimental flags on that flank and assumed the threat was still sitting there. The men behind the flags were already marching, unseen, toward the decisive point. The truly decisive move, though, was with his cavalry, and it's the most underappreciated part of the battle. As the great cavalry melee developed on his left toward Ramillies, Marlborough summoned squadrons from his right wing and shifted them, unnoticed, behind his own line, screened by battle smoke and a fold in the ground, to mass them at the point of decision. Villeroy, meanwhile, left around 50 cavalry squadrons standing idle on the wrong flank, unused, because he never grasped where the weight had gone until it was far too late to move them across the outside of that arc. The result was a concentration of force at exactly the spot the French had thinned. The Allied horse broke through, turned the French right, and rolled the entire line up. In under 4 hours, 60,000 men were shattered and streaming from the field. Marlborough himself was unhorsed in the fighting and nearly killed. The French Marshal Villars, no friend of the Allies, later called Ramillies the most shameful, humiliating, and disastrous of routs. Allied losses were around 3,000 to 4,000. French losses perhaps 13,000 or more, and, far more importantly, the collapse of French power in the region. Brussels, Antwerp, most of the Spanish Netherlands fell in the weeks that followed. So, second move. This is the one where the lucky in his opponent's argument is weakest. Because Villeroy wasn't uniquely incompetent, he was simply outthought in real time, on near equal terms, by a man reading the battle faster than he could. If you had to defend Ramillies as the real masterpiece of the three, drop the word Ramillies in the comments, and I'll know I'm among people who've actually looked at the map. But the third battle is the one that complicates the legend, because it's a victory, and it's the beginning of his ruin. By 1709, France was exhausted, and Louis was seeking terms. And it's here, near the summit, that we reach Malplaquet, the battle that a lot of people quietly leave off the highlight reel, and the one that tells you the most about the limits of even a great general. The French had a new commander, Marshal Villars, aggressive and able, ordered by Louis to save the fortress of Mons. Villars took up a position in a gap between two woods and did the sensible thing against Marlborough. He entrenched. Redoubts, breastworks, felled tree barricades, flanks anchored in forest where cavalry and maneuver couldn't easily reach. And critically, Marlborough was delayed. He wanted to attack before those defenses were finished, but the Dutch field deputies and the wider Allied command held him back, and those lost days let Villars turn the gap into a fortress. Now there was no elegant answer. No open flank to turn, no interior lines trick. To save the campaign, Marlborough had to assault prepared field fortifications head-on, the exact kind of battle his whole career was built to avoid. He fought it as skillfully as the situation allowed, hammering the flanks to draw Villars' reserves from the center, and eventually, the weakened center gave and the French withdrew. By the conventions of the day, it was an Allied victory. Marlborough held the field. Villars himself was badly wounded and carried off. But the price was the point. Malplaquet was the bloodiest battle of the entire 18th century. Allied casualties are usually put at somewhere between 20 and 25,000, roughly double the French, precisely because the French spent the day behind earthworks while the Allies advanced into them across open ground. And, decisively, the French army withdrew intact and in good order, pulled off the field by Villars' deputy, the old Marshal Boufflers. The killing blow Marlborough had landed at Blenheim and Ramillies simply never came. Villars grasped it at once and wrote to Louis the line that outlived the battle. "If it please God to give your enemies another such victory, they are ruined. A victory that ruins the winner." And that's more or less what it did. The scale of the slaughter horrified Britain. War weariness curdled into political revolt, and Marlborough's Tory enemies used Malplaquet as a weapon against him. Here's the fact that captures it. Of his 4 great battlefield victories, Malplaquet was the only one for which Queen Anne sent him no personal letter of thanks. Within 2 years, his wife's long friendship with the Queen had collapsed, the political tide had turned, and the general who had never lost a battle to the most powerful army in Europe was dismissed from all his offices amid accusations of prolonging the war and of financial corruption. Charges that were, by the standards of the age, at least partly true, since siphoning contract money to fund intelligence was common practice. So the third move isn't a trick at all. It's the limit of the craft. Proof that when a capable enemy denies you room to maneuver and makes you pay full price, even a spotless record buys you a victory you can't afford. and that the very war that made him was, in the end, what his enemies used to unmake him. So, 3 moves, honestly weighed. At Blenheim, a superb march and a well-run deception helped along by an opponent who divided his command. At Ramillies, near-flawless tactics on equal terms, his least disputed masterpiece. And at Malplaquet, a costly, grinding victory that exposed the limits of maneuver and began his downfall. Never beaten in a battle he fought, and yet the war ended in compromise, and the man himself was cast out. Both of those things are true at once, and that tension is exactly why he's more interesting than the greatest general who never lost slogan makes him sound. So, here's the question I asked you to keep. Which move actually holds up best under an expert's eye? The march to the Danube, the concealed shift at Ramillies, or the terrible arithmetic of Malplaquet? I've got my answer. I'd rather hear yours, so make the case in the comments. And if you know someone who still thinks Marlborough was just the Blenheim guy, send them this. The real story is better and more honest than the statue. Next time, we jump to the Second World War, to a British general so abrasive his own allies repeatedly tried to have him sidelined, and so effective they never quite could. Subscribe so you don't miss him. See you again soon.